Hey everybody, welcome back to the garage. Cone Dodger here with the Supra. And the last time we left off on the Supra, I was kind of stating how the rust repair stuff was taking longer than expected. And that was just doing the back hatch area, which was my first experience in really doing any welding or any kind of rust repair at all. And I stated that it was going to take a lot longer than I expected. The windshield stuff, which was the main issue, main concern with this car, and really the biggest reason we ended up doing this whole strip it down to basically a bare chassis kind of deal to begin with, that was the biggest issue. That was the biggest hurdle to cross. And it has taken a lot of time, but as of this point, the windshield frame is finally something that doesn't resemble Swiss cheese. So if you go back and look at the earlier episodes, you'll remember that this whole section here basically didn't exist. This whole area of the windshield frame had rusted out, and there was multiple rust holes along the frame where the factory trim molding was once attached. All of those issues have been resolved. I'm not going to say they're perfect. Welding this very thin sheet metal is still something that is, I would say, beyond my skill level as a welder, but I was able to get it good enough, and hopefully with the windshield in there, there will be no more water making its way inside from this area. This part here, it took a lot more fabrication than I knew it would take a lot, but I know it's just above, like I said, my skill level. I did the best I could with it. The tricky part with stuff like this that I have found is that these unibody cars, they're made in layers. This whole car is an onion. Just look right here. So there's a layer, and then this layer is on top of another layer. So it's not as though you can just, take a piece off and replace it, because you'd have to take 4 other pieces off to get there. And all of these pieces are spot welded together or seam sealed together. They're not panel welded together. So this kind of repair, this area here, I bet you in this section has more weld in it than the entire firewall has, because it is simply spot welded together, and that is how unibody cars are constructed. It just made it a much more interesting and intricate kind of experience trying to piece it back together. I've matched it as well as I could to the factory profile to make sure the windshield adheres correctly. I did the best I could. We'll see. Now I have coated it in a rust barrier material inside and out. Well, it's inside as best as I could. I'm also applying, if they hadn't put that sticker there, that's POR 15. That is a very strong rust inhibitor, and you can apply it like directly to rust to keep the rust from spreading. And I'm using that in areas that were particularly hard to get to and hard to get the corrosion out of. And that should hopefully stop this rust issue from continuing in the future. Most of what we've seen here caused by leaves and decaying matter causing water to pool up in places. So hopefully with enough care from its current owner, such issues won't be as prevalent. But if it does happen, hopefully this stuff will help prevent the rust from forming again. And when I say leaves and decay, let me see if I can get a shot of this. What you're looking at there is the AC blower motor, and what you're seeing in there is tons of leaves and other, tree debris and stuff like that. And this was a replacement blower. We did this well after he got the car, so that was continuing to happen, of course, because all of this area was missing, and just stuff getting into places where it shouldn't be. All of this is covered by a cowl piece, so of course that will be hidden. So all of the welding stuff that I was doing, basically stuff that will never be seen when the car is together. But I try to make it as smooth as I could to make sure we don't have any water pocketing in the future. So there we go. That's where we stand. It took way longer than I expected. I ended up like burning through an entire tank of gas on the welder through this process. And like I said, I'm sure it wasn't done perfect. I'm sure it wasn't done correctly by a welder's standards, but it's good enough. I'm hoping to get by for, I mean, hopefully forever. Like I said, this car should be much more taken care of now than it ever was before. So hopefully we can prevent stuff like that from happening in the future. We did grab the moonroof from the parts Supra that we have, and you remember the moonroof that we had is severely rusted. We knew we had another moonroof. I wasn't 100% sure of its condition, but we do have that now, and I can tell you it's also not perfect. At first glance, it doesn't look that bad. Like, there's no obvious huge gaping holes in it. There are, however, the same exact issues that the other one had. We're already starting here. So you can see that corrosion was getting real bad. Now the tricky part is we've already started to somewhat take it apart, but this rubber seal that goes all the way around it, in order to 100% disassemble this and truly fix the rust on it, we would have to take off this rubber seal, and I can guarantee you, just judging by the way that seal feels, if we take that off, it ain't never going back on there. So basically what I've decided is Slag is going to take this to his shop, because he works at a interior upholstery shop, and they have a sandblaster there. So he's going to sandblast out all of the rust that is visible, and we're just going to repair this as good as we can get it, fix any of the obvious holes, apply some of that POR 15 stuff into where it is corroded, sand it down, get it smooth, ready for paint, and then actually reattach it to the car, but then have it fixed. So this will no longer be a working moonroof, because we're going to attach it to the car and then seal around the edges and make sure that it no longer lets any water in, because I just don't trust the gutters. I don't trust the seals on any of this. I honestly don't think the moonroof adds enough entertainment value as a working item to worry about causing future issues. If we ever happen to cross a moonroof that was rust free, then sure, the motors and everything work, but with this one, I don't think it's going to happen. And I have experience now at trying to weld on this kind of metal. It's not fun, and it's not going to turn out very well, so we'll do the best we can with it. That, however, is kind of an aside, because the next thing up is getting the motor back in here. The reason that the motor stayed out is so we could have easy access to get to the windshield and everything, not worry about damaging any of the drivetrain. But there's no reason now not to put the engine back in. So that's what is up next, and that should get us back to the point of crossing off some things from the list, such as the cooling system revamp. We have a radiator. We already started working on it a little bit, getting the bracketry right for the radiator, but we're gonna have to wait until we get the engine in to see exactly where the new radiator needs to go. We got cooling fans to install with that. We already did on the engine, just kind of an off moment. We put a new thermostat and thermostat housing on the car or on the engine. So the engine should be ready to go back in. The biggest challenge is gonna be the fuel filter assembly. Toyota is notorious for these terrible fuel filters that are attached to the engine block, and it's also attached to the motor mount. So that is what challenge lies ahead of us, getting the motor back in with the new motor mounts and getting the fuel filter and fuel lines and all of that stuff hooked back up. So I suppose that's where we're off to next. So this here is the dust plate for the bottom half of the transmission. Found that on the workbench, not in between the transmission and the engine like it should be. So before we go ahead and put this engine in, we should probably solve that. And there's a couple other loose ends around the drivetrain that need to be taken care of. It would be nice to take care of most of these things before we go ahead and set the drivetrain in the car, and everything's impossible to get to. Also, put the slave cylinder on the transmission, mostly to keep the fork from getting bumped while we are trying to shimmy the engine down in there and knocking the throwout bearing off of its home. Just one less thing to worry about, really. And speaking of things to worry about, the aforementioned fuel filter needs to be installed, which is actually bolted onion style again with the motor mount assembly, which the motor mount assembly needed to come off anyway because we are replacing the factory motor mounts with some polyurethane GM transmission mounts that happen to be the right size. With that done, also taking a look at the alternator situation as we are replacing the factory alternator with a upgraded 7M alternator, but that seems like it's going to require a little bit of modification. Despite the fact the internet said this was a pretty easy changeover, the pulley needs to be machined so it fits correctly, and the bracket needs some work on the car so that the alternator can be tensioned correctly in the future. For now, we're just going to get the alternator bolted up in place, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. That should be just about everything that is needed on the engine before we get it in place. So with both motor mounts ready to go and ready to be mounted to the engine, it's just a matter of shimmying that thing down there and hoping that everything lines up correctly. It's always a little nerve-wracking working with these aftermarket parts that people tell you work, but then, you know, usually require far more modification than they ever let on. According to Jonathan, it's apparently at some point we decided to use the half-ton setting on the engine hoist in order to have an easier time getting the engine in, so that is the only thing that has changed from the point we took it out to putting it back in now. It's going to be pretty much the same procedure in reverse. That is apparently the hand gesture of me telling Jonathan that he needed to step off of the car so that the legs of the engine hoist could slide under the control arms. I also distinctly remember us saying we would buy an equalizer before we put this thing back in so it wouldn't be such a pain to tilt it down. Wonder what happened to that dream. Yeah, this part of awkwardly trying to jack up the transmission to equal out the engine, that's exactly where that equalizer would come in handy. All in all, it wasn't too bad. Probably one of the easier engine installs I've ever done. I even said at some point, wow, this was so much easier going back in than it was coming out. And usually when I say things like that, everything goes terribly wrong. But in this case, it actually did go in pretty easily. But come on, what good is putting an engine in if you don't have a time lapse? was some debate on whether we should put the header on before we put the engine in. There's still some work to be done on the header. We still need to do that O2 sensor relocation, which I am apparently having some kind of riveting conversation about what we need to do with this bizarre long tube. We've already talked about it, but it's just a bad design. But that, I think, will be a battle for another day. It was a good day of progress. Mostly, I'm just really happy to have the windshield stuff done. And it's just very relieving to get the engine back in. It makes the project seem like it has a much more obtainable goal of being finished. So, yeah, hopefully this is a good step towards making some serious progress on taking care of that list that we haven't crossed anything off in, like, multiple videos. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll be back soon with some more Project Supra.